Luke and chapter 1. Let's have a look at it together. Now, you'll know that Easter is a high point in the Christian calendar, the high point, and in a few weeks' time we'll be celebrating it again here in Ireland. It was after the very first Easter that people, first in their ones and twos and tens and twenties, and then people by their thousands, began to define their lives according to that central figure, the historical figure at the very center of everything, Jesus Christ. And today, millions of people mark Easter in some way. Now, some of them, it's true, mark Easter for cultural or for all sorts of religious reasons and for the sake of tradition and a bit of chocolate for sure. But many, many people don't just celebrate a festival at Easter. And if you went with these many people, and it wasn't creepy, but if you went with them into their houses and you observed them in their rest of the year routines, you'd find out that they weren't just observers of a first century religious phenomenon, but instead they were followers. So more than distantly taking part in a special day, lots of people have decided to follow Jesus. And all of this has huge implications for their lifestyle, their priorities, their spending, their hopes, and their dreams. And so today there are children, teens, young adults, middle-agers, older people, people from every country in the world, every background that you can think of, who are not just observing Easter, but following Jesus. And I know that includes many people who are watching today. And we're right to wonder why. Why do some people invest more than just a passing glance at Jesus Christ as they live their lives? Well, over the next few weeks, we're going to consider that here. These short talks are hopefully a little bit of insight. And whatever you think about Easter and the things that are mentioned, you're going to notice that the person described here in Luke's Gospel and the events that took place, as well as even the way they're recorded, all unashamedly beckon people like you and me to come closer and to come follow. Well, today in this first part of this series, we're going to see that there's real certainty about Jesus' existence. And whether you're a Christian or not, you can have certainty that Jesus really did exist and he really did do those extraordinary things that were claimed about him. Now, Luke, as we've been reading here, Luke was the writer of two books in the New Testament. This one called Luke, or the Gospel according to Luke, and then there's the fifth book of the New Testament called the Acts of the Apostles. Luke had been a person who accompanied Paul, who wrote a lot of the New Testament as well. And Luke had accompanied Paul on his travels, and he spent a lot of time with him. And so setting out to write this book, the book that we're reading from, he explains that his aim was to provide the person he addresses his work to, someone called Theophilus. He's aiming to provide Theophilus with certainty. Certainty, Luke recognizes, is pretty important. Especially if you or I are going to cast more than just a passing glance in the direction of Easter this year. And the fact that we can have certainty that Jesus really lived and that he really said the things he did, well, that's one of the compelling reasons we have to follow him. Now, whenever I finished school at the end of the 1990s, I took up a place at Trinity College in Dublin to study what by that time had become my passion as a teenager, history. It was the subject I loved in school. It was the thing I loved to read, spend my time on. Well, eventually, during those years at Trinity, we were encouraged not just to read the books in the library, and there were a lot of books in the library, but to roll up our sleeves, so to speak, and get into all the state papers and the files of documents that were available in the archives. My particular interest was 20th century Irish history, and so there were many opportunities at the various locations around Dublin to request files of those original documents and then sift through them as we did our research for assignments. And sometimes I was able even to interview people who had lived through the events in question. And I can tell you I had a much longer list of eyewitnesses that I wanted to interview. One of those eyewitnesses, I was studying a period in the 1950s when Ireland had economic expansion that up to that point hadn't been possible. And one of those people that I studied was a man called T.K. Whitaker, who was a civil servant, very, very much part of the project to get Ireland thinking about economic expansion. And in 1958, he wrote, along with a team, a very, very important piece, a document called the First Programme for Economic Expansion. Now, you may not be interested in that. I was really interested in that. And you know what? Years later, one time when we were having soup over at a hotel nearby, near Blackrock, I saw him having lunch there with a granddaughter or a relative. And you know, I was really tempted, this man in his late 90s, to go over and speak to him, interview him, one of the eyewitnesses to one of the big changes in Irish society that I'd studied. But I didn't. I didn't go over. But he was there. He was within reach. Well, you know, as well as being interesting, all this study of history and archives, it was really, really hard work. And sometimes after hours and hours of study, I had pages and pages of notes, but still many, many questions that were unanswered. And eventually that research work, over time, I'd compile into essays and I would submit them as part of my degree. It might sound a cliche, but the whole experience of checking sources and carefully working through primary sources really brought the history to life. Well, back to Luke here, because in the New Testament, Luke is describing in this preface, this introduction, the kind of detailed and hard-working project that he's undertaken. Luke tells us that he has written an orderly account, something that others have been doing too. Verse 1, we learn that many, he tells us, have similarly undertaken to compile a narrative, that is, to write about the things that have been accomplished among us. End of verse 1. What Luke hasn't done then is he hasn't just embellished a good story that somebody told him once. He hasn't just added spice to an old tale doing the rounds. And Luke he certainly isn't writing to entertain people or to generate an income either. Instead, his research, his hard work, was all pointed towards bringing certainty. But that's the problem for a lot of people. And maybe that's you, coming to Luke's orderly account. The prior question in your mind might be whether even achieving something like certainty is possible. Well, at university, it wasn't long before, as well as having lots of books to read and lots of archives to research, I came face to face with postmodernist ideas, assumptions that come from this whole way of looking at the world. People were questioning, and you know, people are still questioning whether or not we can actually know anything and whether we can even be certain of anything. Now, if you think about it, while not even the best historian can know his subject exhaustively, they can know and have lots of certainty about things without ever claiming to know things in their entirety. Don Carson makes the point, and I find this very helpful. He says that certainty is possible to achieve, even with the limits of being a human being. We can achieve certainty, even though it will never be an absolute kind of certainty. And you know, it's also the case that we can both have knowledge and grow in our knowledge of things. Normal experience shows us that too. Remember when you learned to read and write in those first years at school? Well, maybe you don't learn, or you don't remember learning those things, those early years at school. But you'll know, looking back, at every year that went on, you learned more and more, until all of a sudden you didn't have to decode every word, but the lines that you were reading just made sense and flowed. You see, having knowledge is possible, and we can grow in that knowledge over time. And well, it's the same with certainty. Not absolute certainty, because that's God's domain. But there is robust certainty that's possible, that's available, when we look carefully at the sources and make informed conclusions. And so here's Luke's project in front of us, his orderly account. And it was designed to provide this kind of certainty to those who read it, to those who read about the things that they had been taught about Jesus Christ. Certainty that he really did exist, and he did do all the things that he was supposed to have done. You know, there must have been so many reports and talk of all that had gone on with Jesus. And Luke sets out in the middle of all this. Have a look at verse 3 here. He writes, "It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught." Now you might be wondering, what sources did Luke consult then? Well, look at verse 2. It describes them. Luke says, "Just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us." So whenever Luke was doing this project, he went back to the eyewitnesses. He himself wasn't an eyewitness, but he went back to those who were. He had a word in their ear. He went up to them in the cafe and asked them the questions. To those who had been there and seen for themselves and been part of things, all those things that had happened, he spoke to and he heard from people who actually knew Jesus, whose lives had been turned around as a result. So Luke was a little bit like a very good investigative historian, a historian at work, making sure that he wrote down what he found out and that what he wrote actually matched what had happened. This word eyewitnesses here in verse 2, well, it's a technical term, and it's the same word that Jesus uses for his closest followers, his apostles. Eyewitnesses, those who had watched and followed Jesus from the start of his ministry. And then if you look at that next phrase too, ministers of the word, well, that's really significant. It's often used of people who were appointed to official roles in the courts or in the military. So Luke's referring to people who have carefully and deliberately delivered something. Did you see that word there? Delivered. Delivered is the word used. In other words, handed over a body of evidence. Luke's careful, investigative, historical work towards certainty comes from trustworthy sources. Well, here's what we've seen so far. Luke's aim in all of this was certainty. Verse 4. Certainty, as we've seen, is important. It was important for Luke too, and for us, especially given the gravity of the claims that will be made here in this book and the implications for our lives, if they are true. And we've also seen then that certainty can be hard work. Luke he had rigorous investigation. It was hard work, not just some random musings for himself or for anybody else. And then importantly, we've also established that certainty is possible, and that Luke's certainty came from trustworthy sources here in verse 2. Now, as you go on to read this book, introduced in these couple of verses, something else really stands out here. It's signaled by something important that Luke has said right in the very opening line, the very first verse. Have a look back at it now at Luke chapter 1, verse 1. He writes, "Many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us." Now that word accomplished implies fulfillment. What Luke is saying, that with the arrival of Jesus and all that Jesus did, the things of the Old Testament, the things that were spoken about there and looked forward to, well, they were being fulfilled. They were being accomplished in the person of Jesus Christ. And that's picked up again and again in Luke as he uses this word. Look what's been accomplished. Look how this fits in with what you already know to be true about God and what God promised. You see, that's what Luke does. It's a really interesting way that should signal to us that this is all very important. And if you think about it, it adds to that certainty that Jesus really was much, much more than just an interesting or impressive historical figure. Jesus was worthy of more than a few lines of history. And if you look at secular historians, we get that. We get that he was an important miracle worker, that he existed, or we get just a line or two. But Luke gets it, that he's worthy of more than that. He's worth more than even a few months or a few years of research. For this author, for Luke, and remember Luke wrote about a quarter of the New Testament, this book of Luke and the book of Acts. Well, Luke is convinced, and all this is backed up by his careful research, that Jesus Christ is central. He's worth following. Now, for this colleague, Theophilus, that he's writing to, and for any of us, you can really sense that, as Luke writes, there's a determination that we too would understand the significance of Jesus Christ. Yes, Luke is a careful historian, but unashamedly, he's more than that. It's like he's a passionate advocate. He wants those looking on to understand the real significance, the importance, and in fact, the centrality of Jesus Christ. You see, there's a certainty here that centers on Jesus Christ. Even as you read through it, you can't get away from Jesus Christ. Everything points to him and eventually points to his death and his resurrection. Now, if you haven't read Luke, or perhaps haven't read it in a long time, why don't you read it as we go through this series just before Easter? Luke's intro, and then as he gets into the body of this writing, it reveals that he's unashamedly putting the spotlight on Jesus Christ. Careful, detailed work, yes, but more than a project just to convince people to concede to the bare historical facts of the reality of Jesus. Luke's actually inviting us. He's inviting us to come and follow Jesus. Come follow. And the body of evidence he encountered, well, it changed the course of human history and the course of his own life. Now, I've spoken today about being a historian whenever I was studying for my degree. And as a historian, when I was working in the archives and reading books, I discovered many, many interesting things. I even enjoyed the pursuit of those things and describing and commenting and compiling those things in my assignment. But having investigated these events as well, this person, the result is that I've encountered a truth that's not just interesting, but one that's changed my life. And certainly, I found certainty about his existence. But more than that, it's led me and many others, many of you watching this message today, many people who have read and reread the Bible have come to that realization, not only that we can be certain about his existence, but that we also have an aching need for what he came to do and achieve on our behalf. Well, if you're a Christian, I hope that reading these introductory words from Luke will give you more certainty about Jesus. And you may find that as you read Luke in the run-up to Easter, you'll be refreshed in your desire, maybe given more boldness in that desire to share the message of Luke's gospel with the people around you. After all, we can have certainty about his existence. We can have certainty about what he said, what he did. And if you're not yet convinced about any of this, I hope that in these few lines, you'll hear that invitation to consider seriously these things, to see the unmistakable way Luke is beckoning you to look at Jesus Christ. And then, do you know what? Maybe you'll undertake your own investigation. I hope you do. And I hope that in time, you too will come and follow Jesus Christ. Well, I really hope you'll join us for the next talk, where we're going to find some clarity about Jesus' mission.